Welcome to Suisi 2021. Today I'm going to talk to you about what is foreign policy and what are the actors and factors that help shape American foreign policy. So when we talk about American foreign policy or even any other country's foreign policy, what are we really talking about? And that is itself important because sometimes these issues are so complex that they are interdomestic, which means domestic and international, and it's very difficult to separate the international from the domestic. And often foreign policy is shaped by domestic politics and domestic concerns. In fact, many people have opined that war and American foreign policy is the way Americans do domestic politics. So foreign policy is sometimes an instrument of domestic politics. But I feel that these are the 5 elements that we should be familiar with. One of the most important things that you do when you're talking about foreign policy is talking about what are national interests, either understood in terms of grand strategy or understood just in terms of how we see threats externally, or we see internal impulses to do something overseas. So national interest is one of the key elements of defining what will determine how a country will act abroad. And then once you have your national interests very clear, this is a very complicated process of even coming to a consensus as to what is a national interest. Then you move to a strategy, to articulate a strategy on how to preserve national interests, how to advance national interests. And usually strategy is composed of 2 things. One is the goals that you articulate, and the second is the means with which you try to achieve those goals. So if you assume that respect for democracy and human rights is part of your national interest, then you have to develop a strategy for promoting democracy and human rights. So you set yourself goals and you say, okay, we will try to ensure that authoritarian states are unwelcome in international forums. We will try to discourage trade with authoritarian states, and then definitely we will send the message that dictators are unwelcome. So you start setting up goals, and then you may decide that the means could be diplomatic, economic, which means sanctions, or incentives such as aid, and then of course use of force. Americans' leadership, especially presidents, have often said that we can never take force off the table, but usually force is the last means by which you try to achieve your national security and national interest goals. And then of course, because every nation now is a member of the International Society of Nation States, there are some routine things that you have to do which fall under the umbrella of foreign policy, which is maintaining relations with other states, facilitating trade with other states, travel of people from one country to another, and also the support and facilitation of international organizations, and all of that I just club under consular diplomacy and business aspects of foreign policy. So essentially, when we are talking about US foreign policy towards Russia, US foreign policy in the Middle East, or long-term US foreign policy, we are looking at, besides the consular diplomacy and business side of it, we are essentially trying to understand what are national interests, how are they defined, what is the strategy employed to achieve these national interests, what are its goals, and what are its means. The second thing that I would like to suggest to you is that US foreign policy has both domestic and external factors. So there are things that might happen in the domestic environment which might compel the US to act overseas. So for example, there could be a rise of Islamophobia in American politics, and that could result in a foreign policy that blocks refugees from the Muslim world, or stops the sales of weapons to Muslim countries, etc. So there could be something that is happening in the domestic environment, which compels the US to adopt certain kinds of foreign policy. Then, of course, there are external threats and opportunities. There could be the possibility to create an alliance with economies which are doing well, and so there is a reason for the United States to economically engage overseas. There could be threats emerging from other places, such as right now people talk about how there could be nuclear threats from China, from North Korea and Iran, and also talk about how China's growing power and China's military and economic power is essentially a threat to the United States. But not only that, but China's increasing influence, especially in Latin America and Africa, and also in Central Asia, is basically making the U.S. irrelevant in these areas of the world. So these developments overseas will then motivate the United States to adopt foreign policy initiatives, foreign policy programs, diplomatic initiatives, which will then try to combat Chinese influence in these areas. So generally, there are domestic and international factors which drive any country's foreign policy as well as the US. But I also submit that countries also have grand strategies. And grand strategy is a long-term vision of how the United States or any country would not only like to secure its its national security and its interests, but also would like to secure its place in the global order. And so, for example, the United States is a dominant player in the world today, and so the United States would like to essentially maintain the status quo for a long term so that the United States remains a dominant player in international relations. So this is one way of thinking. So you could look at a country like China, and China could have a grand strategy where it hopes to reconnect the international community to China, so that China becomes the hub of global society, and in the long run China becomes a more dominant player than NATO or Western alliances or the US. So this could be their grand strategy, that in the next 20 years, next 30 years, they become the biggest economic military power. So while they might be responding to both domestic and external factors, they also have this long-term vision which is also shaping their policies. One could argue that countries which are not very democratic and which have stable and long-term leadership, where they have a president who rules for 10 years, 12 years, etc., might be in a better position to have a long-term grand strategy. But the United States, even though it keeps changing presidents every 4 or every 8 years, and sometimes there are parties that sometimes both Republicans and Democrats have goals which are very far apart, the United States generally has had a very consistent grand strategy, which is to keep the international, the global order open, democratic, amenable to free trade, peaceful, etc. So these are the three things that drive foreign policy. So when you're studying US foreign policy, you should look for all these three things. Usually people neglect to think of grand strategy and mostly talk about domestic and external factors. Okay. If you look at the foreign policy players in the sense who all are involved in making US foreign policy, these are the 6 important players, or 6 types of important players. Constitutionally speaking, foreign policy is essentially the domain of the president as the commander-in-chief, and also the diplomat-in-chief articulates US interests, articulates US foreign policies, sets US goals, decides what means will be used, and the various agencies that are composed under the president's executive play various roles in trying to achieve those foreign policy goals. But in the United States, at least the way the political architecture exists, both the Congress and the judiciary, which are equal partners of government, also play a role. Congress has interesting functions. It funds the military, so even though the president is the commander-in-chief, the Congress essentially controls the budget, so the Congress can increase and decrease the availability of resources and thereby shaping what national interest goals get higher and lower priority by simply funding one and not funding the other goal. The judiciary also occasionally does get an opportunity to define some issues. It is not often the case, but you must have seen very recently when President Trump tried to translate his Muslim ban into a foreign policy. He had to go through various iterations, and the judiciary practically reshaped his Muslim ban policy, and ultimately it just came down to 6 countries. Only 5 of them were Muslim. Iraq was dropped, etc. So judiciary does play a role, not essentially in articulating what are national interests and how they should be achieved, but trying to make sure that the United States government stays within certain defined boundaries while trying to articulate within constitutional boundaries, while trying to articulate national interests and trying to achieve that. Civil society plays a big role, especially the business sector in the United States. The business sector plays a huge role by identifying areas where the United States has to pay attention to. They also finance candidates who win elections. So the business sector plays a huge role in determining who comes into office and thereby having partnerships. And usually, even in conflict resolution issues and promotion of diplomacy, etc., the business sector plays a tremendous role. And sometimes second-track diplomacy is conducted more by business people. And often business people also come into the government temporarily to ensure that the policies of their choice, of their interests, are implemented and prioritized. The media especially plays a big role. One major example is that in the case of Bosnia, the United States government was not very interested in intervening there, but the media kept the issue alive and forced the presidents in the United States to pay attention to it. So there are issues where the media, by either paying attention to it or not paying attention, can also reprioritize foreign policy goals. And it plays a huge role now with the expansion of media into social media, where individuals can also play a tremendous role in how foreign policy is essentially implemented, conducted, and what issues are highlighted. To give you a very tiny example, the Iceland's government had a very tiny quota of refugees from Syria that they were allowing into Iceland, and one school teacher essentially started a social media campaign volunteering herself to host a refugee, and that triggered such a powerful movement that the foreign minister paid attention, the prime minister, etc., and Iceland took more than 10 times the number of refugees they initially had planned to. So social media does also play a role in countries' foreign policy, and in the United States foreign policy also. And if you remember, during President Trump's presidency, his Twitter was basically the main instrument of all kinds of politics. And finally, then in the civil society, there are specific groups like interest groups, lobbies, and think tanks, which play a significant role in providing the forums for debates about what is U.S. national interest, what is the best way. So, for example, we see China as a rising power. So is China a threat, or is China a competition? Is China a challenge, or is China an existential threat to the US? Should we accept China's rise, or should we try to impede China's growth? All of these issues are debated in not just the media, but also in forums hosted by interest groups, by lobbies and think tanks, and they interact with the government essentially to let the government know where at least the elite in the country stands. And so essentially these institutions play a kind of an information and bridge a dialogue between the elite in the society and the government. And oftentimes when parties switch and we have changes in Washington, you find that people who are in the government are now working for these same interest groups, lobbies, think tanks, and and related businesses, and then they are back in the government too. So these are some of the elements. So when you're studying various details of how a particular American foreign policy came about, what are the drivers, we need to at least look at some of these factors. And finally, I'm just breaking up the presidency side of it, the box. So if you look at these boxes here, so the president box, that's the box, I'm just breaking it up. And so the presidents, when you say the president of the United States, it's not just the individual. I mean, of course, some presidents have much stronger foreign policy visions, like Clinton and George Bush Sr. Some presidents just focus on a few tiny issues, leave the rest to the professional working class. And so when we say who else is under the president, these are the elements that constitute the executive. So depending on the president, you could argue that the size of the president's foreign policy office, which in the White House, which will also include the National Security Council, depends. So under some presidents, the National Security Advisor is very prominent, highly respected, enjoys the confidence of the president, maybe a major leader himself or herself, and a lot of thinking is done. The advantage that the president has is the National Security Council is only loyal to the president. They don't need to explain everything to the Congress, are free from the oversight from the Congress, more or less. Unlike the State Department, which is a bigger institution, which also does similar things as articulate foreign policy, maintain diplomatic relations, and execute foreign policy, but they are also scrutinized by the Congress to a great extent. So depending on the president, and depending on who is the Secretary of State and who is the National Security Council, the balance of where foreign policy is articulated and conceived of where is either the State Department or in the NSC. When Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, everything was made there. When he was a National Security Advisor, everything was being done in the White House. Then there are agencies besides the State Department, like the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Defense, who also play not as important role as the NSC and the State Department, but also a significant role in providing the information that the president needs to articulate the foreign policy, alerting him to new threats or potential threats in the future, also trying to tell the president that certain kinds of policies could have unintended consequences which perhaps he and his staff have not imagined, and that's the job of the intelligence to inform the president and their foreign policy. Of course, there is this overlap between foreign policy and national security, because many of the national security policies would also be going through a similar process. It is quite possible the Department of Homeland Security, which I have not listed here, and the Department of Defense would play a greater role when it comes to national security issues than the State Department. But when it comes to foreign policy, the State Department ultimately will have to be playing a very important role, because even if it's not part of articulation of the policy, it will play a role in implementation of the policy itself. So these are some of the institutional architecture of US foreign policy, how it is made, etc. So this should give you a starting point, and then we can talk more about each one of the boxes in different cases as you go along.